William Scott Ritter was born July 15, 1961 to a military family in Florida. He graduated high school in 1979, and later college in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. In 1980 he served in the U.S. Army. In May 1984 he was an intelligence officer in the United States Marine Corps. He served for approximately 12 years. Ritter met his wife, Marina, in Russia in 1989. He was an analyst for Marine Corps Rapid Deployment Force during Desert Storm. He later worked as security and military consultant for mainstream media. Scott was the chief United Nations weapons inspector in Iraq between 1991 and 1998. Ritter resigned from the United Nations Special Commission on August 26, 1998. September 3, 1998, several days after his resignation, Ritter testified before the United States Senate Committee on Armed Services and the United States Senate Committee on Foreign Relations and said that he resigned his position. Quote, out of frustration that the United Nations Security Council, and the United States as its most significant supporter, was failing to enforce the post-Gulf War resolutions designed to disarm Iraq, end quote.
Past and your written letter. You say the illusion of arms control is more dangerous than arms control at all. A view shared by a significant number of very prominent Americans serving in and out of the Congress. Implication being what we have now is the illusion of arms control, and it's hard to deny that that would be a reasonable characterization. You've also stated, and I quote, that the decision to seek diplomatic alternatives to inspection-driven confrontation with Iraq, end of quote, was one of the reasons why you stepped down. Very clear, precise statement that this notion of inspection-driven confrontations with Iraq was an alternative that was shelved by the Security Council, shelved by the United States at this moment, and diplomacy was, of course, sought. And obviously you disagree with that, as many, many experts do. And also, although this is not a quote, you have stated that you believe Iraq and Saddam have made a very basic decision, that they can absorb the kind of air power we threw against them the last time, and it's a price worth paying to be able to maintain, at a minimum, a modicum, at a maximum, a significant portion of their program related to weapons of mass destruction and the ability to use them. The alternative view seems to be, and I'm not getting this in the administration, we'll hear whether this is correct, seems to be that the primary policy is to keep sanctions in place, to deny Saddam the billions of dollars that would allow him to really crank up his program, which neither you or I believe he is ever going to abandon as long as he is in place. But that doesn't guarantee, if these sanctions are in place, that the program is going to be curtailed, anything other than curtailed. Doesn't guarantee that we're going to be able to stop it. I think you and I believe, and many of us believe here, as long as Saddam's at the helm, there is no reasonable prospect you or any other inspector is ever going to be able to guarantee that we have rooted out, root and branch, the entirety of Saddam's program relative to weapons of mass destruction. And you and I both know, and all of us here really know, and it's the thing we have to face, that the only way we're going to get rid of Saddam Hussein is we're going to end up having to start it alone, and it's going to require guys like you in uniform to be back on foot in the desert, taking taking Saddam down. You know it, and I know it. So I think we should not kid ourselves here. There's stark choices. I happen to agree with your assessment. A, that diplomacy was picked over inspection-driven confrontation. B, that there's an illusion of arms control that cannot guarantee he will have no weapons of mass destruction. And C, that as long as he's there, he's concluded he can absorb airstrikes. So I think you've done a significant service for this country. A different policy judgment has been made. If we don't like the policy judgment, in my view, from observation has been made by the administration and the Security Council and our allies. If we don't like it, we should step up to the ball and say it. because you forced us, and I think properly so, to a day of reckoning here about what our policy should be. I look forward to hearing what you have to say, and welcome, even without the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense.
According to reports, Ritter was charged in a June 2001 internet sex sting in New York, but that case was dismissed. He had been charged with attempted child endangerment after arranging in an online chatroom to meet what he thought was a 16-year-old girl at a Burger King restaurant. The girl turned out to be an undercover policewoman. Ritter said, quote, "The criminal charge was a smear campaign in response to his criticizing U.S. policy in the Middle East." End quote. Albany, New York. Former UN weapons inspector Scott Ritter, a harsh critic of the Bush administration's push toward war with Iraq, suggested that recent news reports of his arrest in an internet sex sting in 2001 were part of an attempt to silence him. He said the publicity forced him to cancel a trip to Baghdad, where he said he would have offered an alternative to military action. Quote, "The timing does stink. I was supposed to be on an airplane yesterday to Baghdad," end quote, he said. Quote, "Let's not forget, we're on the verge of a major conflict in which thousands of American lives may be lost, and I was a leading voice of opposition to this." End quote. Quote, "It's a shame that somebody would bring up this old matter, this dismissed matter, and seek to silence me at this time," end quote. He said. Ritter acknowledged his June 2001 arrest in appearances on television on Wednesday night but said he was prohibited from discussing details because the charges were dismissed and the records sealed. Broadcast reports at the time and recent newspaper reports have indicated he was caught in an internet sex sting, something Ritter did not admit. At the time of the arrest, NBC station WNYT-TV of Albany reported that William Scott Ritter Jr., Ritter's full name, was charged with trying to lure a 16-year-old girl to a restaurant. The girl turned out to be an undercover police officer. WNYT broadcast Ritter's mug shot provided by the police but did not make the connection to his role as the chief UN weapons inspector in Iraq during most of the 1990s. He was charged with attempted endangerment of a child, a misdemeanor that carries up to 90 days in jail, according to the Times-Union of Albany. The case was adjourned in contemplation of dismissal, meaning if he stayed out of trouble for 6 months, the charges would disappear and the file be sealed. Quote, "When you dismiss the case and you seal the files, it maintains the presumption of innocence," end quote. Ritter, 41, said in a court TV interview Wednesday. Quote, "So I'm sticking to my ethical and legal obligations not to discuss this case. I wish other people had done that." End quote. When the story initially surfaced Saturday in the Daily Gazette of Schenectady, Ritter told a reporter, quote, "Sorry, you must have the wrong person." End quote. Times-Union, Scott Ritter criminal case costs prosecutor her job. Monday, January 20, 2003 staff report. Colony. The 2001 arrest of former UN weapons inspector Scott Ritter came to light late last week when an Albany County Assistant District Attorney was fired over her handling of the case. A judge sealed the case after it was adjourned in contemplation of dismissal. Colony Police on Sunday declined to discuss the case, citing the sealing order. Last week, District Attorney Paul Klein fired Assistant District Attorney Cynthia Pricer for her handling of the case, saying Pricer failed to notify him about a quote sensitive end quote case. Klein said he launched an internal inquiry into the matter after a reporter from the Daily Gazette of Schenectady asked about a case involving Ritter. Quote, "Based on that inquiry, I determined that I should have been apprised of the existence of the case," end quote. Klein told the Times-Union. Quote, I was not, so Cindy Pricer was fired for failure to keep me abreast of what was going on in Colony Court. End quote. Klein declined to discuss Ritter's arrest. At the time, Ritter said Iraq was, quote, winning its bid to retain its prohibited weapons. End quote. But Ritter seemingly has had a change of heart and now speaks out about a U.S. war against Iraq. He claims inspections could keep Hussein in check. In a move that led many to label him a traitor, Ritter on September 8 became the first American to speak to the Iraq National Assembly. He told the Middle East nation that it needed to allow weapons inspectors to return. Tuesday, January 21, 2003. Mike Goodwin, staff writer. Quote, Assistant District Attorney Cynthia Pricer agreed to have the case adjourned in contemplation of dismissal, which means that charges would be dropped if Ritter stayed out of trouble for a period of time. A Colony Town justice sealed the case after the agreement between the prosecutor and defendant was reached. End quote. District Attorney Paul Klein fired Pricer because she did not inform him about a quote, sensitive end quote case in town court, but Klein would not acknowledge that the case involved Ritter. Defense attorney Michael Koenig said adjournment in contemplation of dismissal was not an unusual outcome for someone charged with a Class B misdemeanor, as Ritter was. Ritter, a former Marine, led a weapons inspection team in Iraq in the 1990s after the Gulf War. He has gained international attention in recent months as a critic of a new U.S. war with Iraq. He has been interviewed frequently on radio and television shows, consistently downplaying the threat posed by Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein. Ritter's days as a leading voice of the opposition to war could be over if his arrest receives national media attention, said Robert Thompson, professor of media and popular culture at Syracuse University. He said the nature of Ritter's arrest would overwhelm any point he might try to make on a talk show. Quote, when you're a talking head, your whole reason for being has got to be the image of anything you represent, end quote. Thompson said. Quote, if the story starts getting to be a big issue, there will be talking heads making their careers on the end of this talking head. End quote. Times Union, Feds obtain Ritter records. Saturday, January 25, 2003. Carol DeMare and Ann Miller, staff writers, wrote. Quote, while legal experts said it's not unusual for federal prosecutors to go after information contained in state criminal files, the decision to examine Ritter's case is certain to draw criticism from supporters who feel Ritter is being singled out because of his outspoken views against a possible war in Iraq. End quote. He was charged with a Class B misdemeanor, the least serious state crime on the books, for allegedly setting up a sexual rendezvous with a person who he thought was a 16-year-old girl. Ritter was unaware that he was chatting over the internet with an undercover colony investigator posing as a teenage girl. Police were waiting for Ritter when he showed up at a Burger King in Menands to meet the girl. The case was adjourned in contemplation of dismissal, meaning the charges would be dropped and the records sealed if he didn't break the law for a 6-month period. The deal was negotiated between Assistant District Attorney Cynthia Pricer and Defense Attorney Nora Murphy and was approved by Colony Town Justice Peter Crummy. Last week, Albany County District Attorney Paul Klein fired Pricer. Klein has refused to discuss the case other than to say his staff was told to inform him of all sensitive cases. On Friday, Klein was equally tight-lipped about the impending federal probe of Ritter. Quote, I can neither confirm nor deny the veracity of that report, primarily because you're asking me questions about a case that all the parties have acknowledged is sealed, end quote. Klein said. Quote, I can't comment on another law enforcement agency's dealings with a sealed file. End quote. Ritter finally broke his silence Wednesday after days of negative publicity about his arrest, including reports he had tried to meet with a 14-year-old girl 2 months earlier, in April 2001, and was given a warning by Colony Police. On Tuesday night, Ritter canceled a trip to Iraq because of all the publicity surrounding his arrest. He was dismayed that the 2-year-old Colony case was revealed but refused to discuss the particulars. He insisted the case was dismissed and the record technically expunged. Even in cases where state charges have been disposed of, the federal government can decide to prosecute on similar charges provided they are covered under federal law. It would not be double jeopardy, federal and state officials said. A section of the state criminal procedure law dealing with sealed records allows a law enforcement agency to single-handedly, without notifying the defense, make a motion in a superior court to obtain the records if the agency quote demonstrates to the satisfaction of the court that justice requires that such records be made available to it. End quote. Now that federal prosecutors in Albany have possession of the records, they must obtain permission from the U.S. Department of Justice in Washington before they can bring a prosecution. A possible federal case against Ritter could include the charge of using the Internet to entice a minor to engage in criminal activity, sources said. Over the last week, former prosecutors have questioned the way the Ritter case was handled. Albany County's Klein, while not discussing the Ritter case, said he would not approve of charges involving the luring of a teenager girl over the Internet to a sexual encounter to be disposed of as a low-level dismissal. Former Assistant U.S. Attorney Don Kinsella, who retired last year as head of the Albany office's criminal division and is now an attorney in private practice, feels Ritter may have gotten off easy. Quote, he was allegedly involved in what otherwise would be felony conduct, and it was charged as a Class B misdemeanor and disposed of, and there's no apparent good reason for it, given the seriousness of the alleged conduct, end quote, Kinsella said. For clarification purposes, this is what a contemplation of dismissal is. Links for more information will be in the documentary notes. In some New York City misdemeanor cases, criminal defense attorneys are able to achieve the holy grail of negotiated settlements to keep their clients from pleading guilty to a crime. An adjournment in contemplation of dismissal, ACD, gives a criminal defendant with little or no criminal history the benefit of the court and prosecutor's doubt regarding the charges filed against them. When an ACD happens, a judge agrees to adjourn your case for a period of time, usually 6 months. During that time frame you don't have to do anything except keep from committing any new crimes. In a normal ACD, that means you don't have to pay a fine, admit any guilt, say anything except agree to the ACD. If you follow the requirements of your ACD, once the 6-month or 1-year time period goes by, your case is dismissed and will be sealed by the court, which means the case will not show up on most background and criminal record checks by employers and others. What is an ACD? An ACD isn't a plea, conviction, or admission of wrongdoing. It's also not a period where you're placed on probation. The criminal justice system doesn't distinguish between the dismissal following a not guilty trial verdict and the one after an ACD dismissal. The timing is main difference between the two dismissals. A not guilty verdict after a trial instantly dismisses a criminal case, but with ACDs you have to wait 6 months or a year for dismissal. However, many times it's quicker to receive an ACD dismissal because the preparation leading up to trial and a criminal trial can take even longer. United Press International, Inc. reported. Albany, New York, January 22, 2003, UPI. Headline, Breaking News. Former UN Weapons Inspector Scott Ritter confirmed media reports on Wednesday that he had appeared in an Albany, New York court concerning an arrest in an internet sex sting. Quote, the case was dismissed. Therefore, it never happened, end quote, Ritter told WNYT-TV. Quote, I stood in a court of law, before a judge and an assistant district attorney with my wife at my side, and they dismissed it. I am deeply saddened. Not by anything I've done, though. End quote. Media reports earlier this week about Ritter's arrest in June 2001 have drowned out his comments about a possible war with Iraq. Ritter told WTEN-TV that all the media attention stinks and that the individual who had leaked the arrest was far more guilty than he was. He added that he had a lot of credibility and was the leading voice of opposition to a possible war with Iraq, but that he didn't know if the reports of the arrest would mean he would be silenced. Ritter, a 41-year-old native of Gainesville, Florida, whose full name is William Scott Ritter, Jr., has lived in the Albany suburb of Delmar with his wife and their twin daughters for 2 years. The June 2001 arrest was not William Ritter's first brush with the law. In April 2001, William Ritter attempted to meet someone he thought was a 14-year-old girl he met online but who in reality was an undercover police officer posing as an underage minor. He was met at the meeting place by police officers but released without being charged. A CNN report in 1998 said that Iraqi officials blocked Ritter's team from conducting searches of possible Iraqi weapons sites, claiming he was a spy for the CIA, a charge the United Nations and the United States denied. At the time, the UN Security Council approved a statement deploring the Iraqi move to block Ritter's team, and Clinton said Iraqi officials would not be allowed to decide the makeup of inspection teams. Ritter resigned from the United Nations in 1998 because he felt that Iraq remained insufficiently disarmed and ready to restart its nuclear and biological weapons programs. The 6'4" former Marine subsequently changed his view on Iraq and has become a regular on network and cable news programs criticizing President George W. Bush and calling for his impeachment for putting members of the American military in a war he considers, quote, illegal and based on a foundation of lies. End quote. He says that Iraq's chemical, biological and nuclear weapons program must either accounted for or destroyed. Ritter explained his reasons for his change of heart in the documentary, In Shifting Sands, which he wrote and directed. A wealthy Iraqi-American businessman, Shakir al-Kafaji, reportedly contributed $400,000 towards the 91-minute account of the UN Weapons Inspection Team in Iraq, known as UNSCOM. The former inspector also spoke before the Iraq National Assembly last September urging Iraq to allow weapons inspectors to return. Ritter called the UN weapons inspectors' recent discovery of empty warheads in Iraq an accounting problem and an indication that the weapons inspectors were doing their job. Quote, Iraq should take a more proactive action and send military officers to every ammunition depot and open up every box to ensure this never again happens and give a full accounting, end quote, Ritter said on CNN last Friday. However, Ritter has said that if the inspectors find evidence that Iraq is attempting to procure or manufacture or has manufactured and is hiding an active chemical agent, quote, then we have a right to presume ill intent on the part of Saddam Hussein and hold them to account. End quote. The Guardian reported on 23 January 2003. Ritter cries foul at sex arrest, smear. Scott Ritter, the former UN weapons inspector and an outspoken critic of war in Iraq, yesterday claimed he was the victim of a smear campaign after it emerged that he had been arrested in an internet sex sting in June 2001. Mr. Ritter cancelled a trip to Baghdad on Tuesday and has instead been appearing on talk shows to defend his reputation. In an interview with CNN on Wednesday, he refused to discuss details of the arrest and attempted to shift the focus onto who leaked the story. Quote, the case was dismissed. The file was sealed. Why did this come up now? End quote, he said. Quote, I have no way of knowing why this happened. But the effect is obvious. I was supposed to fly to Baghdad on a personal initiative that could have had great ramifications in regards issues of war and peace. End quote. The New York Post said Mr. Ritter had been caught in a similar case involving a 14-year-old girl in April 2001 but was not charged. Mr. Ritter, a former U.S. Marine, spent 7 years as a UN weapons inspector, quitting in 1998. He has since become a thorn in the side of the Bush administration, which he accuses of warmongering. Ritter's book was released July 1, 2003, Frontier Justice: Weapons of Mass Destruction and the Bushwhacking of America. During this time period there were a number of predators convicted due to perverted-justice.com sex sting operations. Here is a little more about them. Back when we started in 2003, there was no Twitter, no Facebook, and Google wasn't much more than a search engine. Amazon was mostly known for selling books, even without social networking. Most socializing online when we started up happened in large chat rooms on the networks of the major players at the time. MSN chats, AOL chats and Yahoo chats. Thusly, we set ourselves up to put decoy profiles into those chats, mostly focusing on regional chat rooms to deal with the issue of adults preying on minors online. When we started, there were few laws on the books across the country against trying to solicit a child online. We even wrote the majority of one law and testified in front of a few state legislatures to get them to catch up to the internet era. With our early work doing stings with local media, the issue came to national prominence. That culminated in NBC's To Catch a Predator series, where millions upon millions became aware of the widespread problem of adults attempting to sexually assault minors they met online. That work led to hundreds of convictions and laws across the country being enacted to deal with this issue. Meanwhile, the element we were inspired to work, chat rooms, all died off. Some due to the fact that the attention and trouble caused by the media exposure of internet predators had made them unattractive to continue operating. Others died off later on as social networking made them obsolete. Few remnants of the chat room era of the internet still exist at this point. As the internet changed, elements like Twitter and social networking in general has spread the problem wide and thin. Internet predators are no longer confined to mostly a few deep wells as they were when we started up. Internet access for younger generations is ubiquitous, they're connected at an earlier age.